Coming up, humiliation, be useful, and what the Terminator, Schwarzenegger, and Lafayette have in common. Welcome to Living Lafayette. For the Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. And there's Tony Privatera right there, the podcast master. So all those graphics and photographs you see on the podcast, that's Tony. He does a great job. Teenagers have had a difficult time of it in every generation. Lafayette was a teenager. He was 20, but still. It's interesting that there was a piece in Time magazine not long ago where teenagers were interviewed. And they argued that today, teenagers of this generation have it harder than teenagers in former generations. They say that there are always the dramas about family and dramas about first love and all those sorts of those things don't change. But they say this era is different because teenagers are fire hosed with bad news just all the time, that with cell phones now, you can be defriended from a distance. I mean, in times past, you could sort of save yourself the humiliation. If you didn't like somebody, well, you just sort of ignored them and they got the message. But now, so you're defriended, the box is checked, or you see all those great photographs of everybody having, all your friends having a good time at a party to which you were not invited. So these teenagers argued that it's a difficult time these days and more difficult than before. And maybe they have a point. It was also curious that in the same issue, Time, Keith Richards said that he's 79 now. He said that he got addicted to heroin, he got addicted to cocaine, to cigarettes, and he kicked all those addictive habits. But he says he never got addicted to the one thing that is addicting all of America today, cell phones. He says he never got started with that. And he says, in fact, that rather than trolling the cell phone, he prefers to spend time with books. Keith Richards is now someone for teenagers to look up to, a mentor. Isn't that curious? Of course, it took him 79 years to get there, and it was a rough ride on the way. I'm also curious about what books Keith Richards reads. If you have his cell phone, if you go to LafayetteLaGrange.org, just leave his cell phone for me. I won't share it, but I'd like to talk with Keith Richards and see what books he reads and who recommends those books. It's also curious that recently, the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, put out his memoirs, and it's called Be Useful. And I don't know whether he knows about Lafayette or not, but he took a page out of Lafayette's playbook for that title, and we'll talk more about that later. But it's curious that Schwarzenegger, he was interviewed, and the interviewer tried to goad him, saying, don't you have regrets, don't you have resentments, that your growing up was hard, that your parents were disciplinarians, your father particularly, and don't you regret and resent that? And Schwarzenegger wouldn't have any part of it. He said that he didn't have those sorts of resentments, that those are corrosive, that things just happened and you deal with them. Lafayette had learned that lesson too, and we'll talk about that. Resentment is corrosive. Schwarzenegger, by the way, does have a link to Lafayette. Back in about 2003, there was an animated feature series. It's called Liberty's Kids. There were about 40 episodes, each of them about 30 minutes. And one of the characters was Baron von Steuben. Schwarzenegger voiced von Steuben in Liberty's Kids. And Schwarzenegger's nemesis, part of that is probably played up, Sylvester Stallone, he voiced Paul Revere. So Lafayette was a teenager with all those perspectives that teenagers have. So he wanted people to like him. He had these visions of grandeur, and now he had opportunity to achieve those things. You remember he was commander of the Army of the North, and it was his responsibility now for this incursion into Canada. He was going to command the force that would capture Montreal, and then the rest of Canada would follow suit. So surely Lafayette, in his mind's eye, knew that when this was accomplished, that King Louis XVI would declare a Lafayette Day in France, that there would be a ticker tape parade in Paris or its equivalent, that women would swoon. All teenage boys figure women will swoon. They try to think up something for women to swoon. So Lafayette surely had this in his mind's eye. And he'd written to his wife, Adrienne, to tell her about his good fortune. And by the way, share this with the rest of the family. Tell them how good I'm doing over here and with friends. Then Lafayette arrives at Albany, New York, where all the troops were to have amassed. And they weren't there. There were not enough troops. They hadn't been recruited. There was not enough money in the treasury to get the sleighs and the resources that they needed. It was a fiasco. None of it was ready. This incursion into Canada, it just didn't look to Lafayette like it could be done. It was unsettling, to say the least. Lafayette was depressed about it. This would reflect on his reputation, and that was important to him at the time. That this would be seen as a failure on his part. How could he show his face? I remember back in high school, there was a very attractive girl, Julia was her name, and she got a comedone, a pimple on her chin. She refused to come to school. Now, I never saw the pimple. I just heard about it. So it was the pimple heard around the world. For Lafayette, this whole Albany incursion was one big pimple. How was he ever going to show his face? Lafayette also had to worry about politics. This move, this swing to try to replace George Washington, his good friend, his mentor, as commander-in-chief, was still underway. There were those who were really pushing for a replacement. They thought that Washington was not aggressive enough. So this was that loose conspiracy, the so-called Conway Cabal. So members of the Board of War, which had been established by Congress, and its president, Horatio Gates, were part of that. General Gates, in fact, was the prime candidate to replace Washington as commander-in-chief. Richard Peters was likewise in favor. Peters was the secretary of the Board of War. And there was Thomas Mifflin, who was quartermaster general, likewise. And of course, General Thomas Conway. There was known antipathy between Conway and Washington. Lafayette, for his part, was very loyal to Washington. He admired Washington, admired his courage. Washington was stoic in the face of all those slings and arrows. Lafayette admired him, thought that he was the man for that position, commander-in-chief. But Lafayette was also the spokesperson for French officers. By default, perhaps, but he was the one who spoke for them, so his opinion counted. So to the extent that it appeared that Lafayette was aligning himself with members of this so-called Conway Cabal. And keep in mind, Lafayette did not have to endorse it at all. It was just appearance. If he appeared to be working with people who favored replacing Washington, well, then people would assume Lafayette's in favor. So to the extent that Lafayette was seen as aligning himself with the Conway Cabal, well, then it would undermine Washington's standing. it would give credence to this whole idea that maybe we do need a replacement for Washington. Lafayette had to tap dance around that. On February 19th, it was a Thursday, Lafayette unburdened himself. He was a letter writer. And he wrote to his two good friends, George Washington and the President of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence. And he told them that this incursion into Canada, that things were not prepared, that he didn't see how it was going to work, and that it was going to reflect on him and his reputation. That same day, he also asked Thomas Conway, who was there in Albany, asked Thomas Conway to write out his observations about this incursion into Canada and whether or not it could be pulled off. The next day, February 20th, it was on Friday, Lafayette wrote two formal letters. One was to General Horatio Gates, outlining his perspectives and observations. The other was to the President of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence, again, outlining his observations of this incursion into Canada and how dicey it was. The following week, on Tuesday, the 24th, Congress received a memo from the Board of War, Horatio Gates and his team, suggesting that this incursion into Canada, maybe it wasn't a good idea. And maybe what they ought to do is pass a resolution that would go to Lafayette, telling Lafayette that, number one, it's your call, your boots on the ground. You decide whether or not you're going to take this army into Canada and capture Montreal. And part two of that missive was, you will report to the Board of War and you'll explain yourself about why you made that decision. Henry Lawrence saw that as the power play that it was. If Lafayette reported to the Board of War, it would give the appearance that Lafayette was aligned with this Conway cabal. So Lawrence argued strongly to Congress that Lafayette indeed be given the discretion about whether or not to pull the trigger to go into Canada, but that he also be given the discretion to report to either the Board of War or to Congress. So Congress didn't have to come down making a decision about where he was going to report. They would give that discretion to Lafayette. The next day, so we're talking February 25th, this was on Wednesday, letters arrived. Those letters that Lafayette had written, he'd written them back on the 20th, the formal letters, to Horatio Gates, to Lawrence, and that letter that Thomas Conway had written out about his observations on this incursion. Major John Bryce arrived with those letters from Albany, and Bryce delivered them to the Board of War. All of those letters were opened at the Board of War, and the assumption, we assumed it was innocent, the assumption, you remember there was a letter to Horatio Gates, fine, there was a letter from Thomas Conway, but there was a formal letter to the President of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence. That letter likewise was opened by the Board of War. It was opened presumably by Richard Peters, the secretary, and presumably innocent, but we don't know that. And true, that letter, it had a generic greeting, sir. It had nothing personal or provocative, but it had not been intended for the Board of War. It was intended for Henry Lawrence. Nonetheless, it was opened, and Horatio Gates then assumed and told Congress, Lafayette has reported to the Board of War, therefore that is Lafayette's choice. So Horatio Gates then composed a letter to go to Lafayette, telling Lafayette that it was at his discretion whether or not he went and pursued this capture of Montreal. And Gates says, you may report to the Board of War and explain yourself. Gates did not tell Lafayette that he also had the discretion to report to Congress. The following day, Thursday, Thaddeus Kosciuszko showed up at York You remember the friendly letter that Lafayette had written back on the 19th to Henry Lawrence. Kosciuszko had come through Albany. He was a Polish engineer, and he wanted to volunteer to fight with the Continental Army, but with the stipulation he'd be under the command of either Washington or Lafayette very specifically. But he came through Albany and met Lafayette, and Lafayette asked him to deliver that informal letter to Henry Lawrence, which Kosciuszko was pleased to do. So when Kosciuszko presented that letter to Henry Lawrence, Kosciuszko also informed Lawrence that Lafayette had sent a formal letter to you a week ago. Well, now the pieces of the puzzle began to fall in place for Henry Lawrence, and he figured that that letter that Gates had received was a formal letter that was meant for him, but that the Board of War had opened, and then Horatio Gates had assumed a victory of sorts. Lafayette was reporting to the Board of War when Lawrence was suspicious about that, because Lafayette had always made a big deal out of his loyalty to Washington. Congress now considered all the data that it had about this incursion into Canada. And on March the 2nd, Lafayette was preparing to go to the peace conference with the Six Nations of the Iroquois. And on that same day, Congress decided that the incursion into Canada was a no-go, that it needed to be aborted. Lawrence reminded Congress that Lafayette was very sensitive over this issue, because if it appeared that Congress were recalling Lafayette, and if it appeared that they were blaming Lafayette, that would not go down well. And Lawrence was aware of that, made Congress aware of that. Therefore, Congress dictated to Gates that Gates write Lafayette and tell Lafayette the incursion is aborted. And at the same time, Lawrence wrote 2 lengthy letters to Lafayette to explain everything that was going on, to explain why Lawrence had not responded to that letter back on the 20th, that the Board of War had opened a letter that was intended for him, Lawrence, and that was the reason for the delay in responding to that one. So those letters were fired off on March the 4th. Lafayette returned to Albany on the 11th, about a week later, and there waiting for him was the letter from Gates saying it's at your discretion. You remember the letter he wrote back on the 25th? That it's at your discretion whether or not you pursue this incursion into Canada. You decide. And you report back to me, back to the Board of War. Did not tell Lafayette about the other option of reporting to Congress. But then later that same day, Lafayette got those letters on delay from March the 4th from Horatio Gates saying Congress has aborted this mission, and the 2 letters from Lawrence that explained the Board of War opened your letter that was intended to me. So Lafayette responded both to Lawrence and to Gates, acknowledging that he'd gotten the initial letters, but then he sat down and wrote Horatio Gates, saying, number one, I don't appreciate the fact that a personal letter that was intended for Henry Lawrence was opened by the Board of War, and I expect the perpetrator to be identified and dealt with. Number two, Horatio Gates had also intimated that there would be changes in the command structure at Albany. It was a very clandestine sort of comment, almost a throwaway, a sidebar, but Lafayette read much into that. Lafayette also told Gates that he needed more money, that the men up there had not been paid, and that just wasn't right, and that he needed the paymaster to be supplied with more money to pay the men. Lafayette thought that what Horatio Gates had in mind as far as command structure adjustment was concerned was that the Board of War would recall Lafayette and DeKalb and leave them without command and under the direction of the Board of War, which means they could just be in limbo. They wouldn't have any command, they'd have nowhere to go, Lafayette could see that writing on the wall, and he didn't want to give that a chance. So he wrote this to Horatio Gates, and he also wrote an impassioned letter to Congress the next day saying that I understand there are going to be some changes in the command, and if it comes down as I think, it will be an affront. That recalling me to be under the Board of War will not work. Putting Thomas Conway, which is what Lafayette feared, in command at Albany will be an affront as well. Conway does not have the standing to get that command. And Lafayette also wrote a personal letter to Henry Laurens that day, the 12th, where he was adamant. He said that we shouldn't be treated this way. I nor DeKalb should be treated this way. That Conway does not deserve to be put in command. He is self-centered. He wants to replace Washington. And if you recall me and put Conway in command, it will make it appear that you're blaming me for this lack of preparation up here. Lafayette was very adamant, almost blustery in it. He also wrote a letter that day to Baron von Steuben. Von Steuben had been in the 7 Years' War. He had been an aide-de-camp to Frederick II of Prussia. And the dynamics are unclear, but he wound up leaving the Prussian army and found himself in Paris. He was looking for work. Peacetime is difficult on military men. So he was looking for work, and he met Benjamin Franklin. Franklin appreciated von Steuben's martial bearing, his knowledge, and Franklin thought that von Steuben would have a lot to offer the Continental Army. Well, Franklin didn't have authority to give a commission to von Steuben. He didn't have authority to give him pay, but he could give him enough money to make it to America, give him passage to America and a letter of introduction. So on September the 26th, von Steuben boarded the Flamande at Marseille and headed for America. Arrived there on December the 1st at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then through Boston, and then December the 5th arrived at York. And the Continental Congress, they were impressed, and they said, okay, a trial run. You can serve as a volunteer and go ahead to Valley Forge under Washington's command, where he arrived on February 23rd, 1778. He arrived there with his Italian greyhound Azor. He went everywhere with Azor. Von Steuben spoke German and French, no English. So when he got to Valley Forge, at least John Laurens, that was Henry Laurens' son and one of Lafayette's best friends, and Alexander Hamilton, both of them spoke French. But Baron von Steuben also thought that Lafayette would be at Valley Forge. That's what he'd been given to understand. And when he arrived, Lafayette wasn't there. So von Steuben wrote Lafayette a letter. So now Lafayette sat down to reply to this letter. This is on March the 12th. And it's interesting that the tone and temperament of that letter is totally different from the passionate letter that Lafayette had sent to Congress and then sent to Henry Laurens. Lafayette knew that von Steuben would have heard about Albany, would have heard about the fiasco, because people tend to focus on the worst segments. Lafayette was aware of that, teenager that he was. He was aware of that and sensitive to it. So he wrote a letter that said, yep, things here weren't prepared, they weren't ready, but this is a young army. Things happen. You deal with it. Lafayette did not show any resentments. He regretted that things weren't together, but it wasn't like he really had this burning resentment. That was clear in this letter. He also was aware that von Steuben would hear about this Conway cabal. He would hear those who would denigrate Washington, and Lafayette didn't want von Steuben tainted by those opinions. So Lafayette in this letter wrote admirably. He lauded Washington, his courage, his stoicism, because he wanted von Steuben to be in his, that is Lafayette's and Washington's camp, and then fired those letters off. This is March the 12th we're talking about, by Colonel Armand, was to take them back to York and get them to Valley Forge. So Lafayette now, these things were burdening him. He was worried about them. And so he stayed busy. He tried to be useful. Surely where Schwarzenegger got the name of his book. So Lafayette spent time recruiting Indians for the Continental Army. He spent time talking with Governor Clinton, with General Schuyler. He ordered forts built out on the frontier for protection. He stayed busy. As it turned out, things were going to work out. The Congress ordered a letter sent to Lafayette on March 13th saying that they were going to send a resolve to Washington that Washington should recall Lafayette and DeKalb back to Valley Forge. So Lafayette and DeKalb now would be back under Washington's command there at Valley Forge. Things were going to work out. Washington didn't get around to sending that missive to Lafayette until the 20th, almost a week later. But the 13th, the same day that Congress had sent the resolve to Washington, Henry Laurens sent a personal letter to Lafayette saying it's going to work out. You're going to get orders from Washington to return to Valley Forge. It'll work. So it seemed like everything was calming down. Initially, Lafayette had suggested that maybe he could be put in command at Fishkill, New York. He could take command there, and if he did, that means that Thomas Conway, even if Conway stayed at Albany, would be under his command. Things would work out. Well, as fate would have it, you remember those letters, passionate letters Lafayette had written back on March 12th. They arrived in York. So now the Congress opened up these letters where Lafayette was saying, this is not right, the way you're being treated, the way we're being treated, the changes in command structure. If we're going to be treated this way, I can just go back to France. And if I go back to France, all the French officers will follow me. Well, Congress was in a dither over that. So they put together what we Americans tend to do when we're trying to resolve things, a committee. And the committee was to decide how to respond. And what they decided was, of course, that Washington would recall Lafayette and DeKalb, and Congress on March 24th sent a letter to Lafayette saying, we appreciate you, none of this was your fault, and you're needed at Valley Forge. I remember March 24th because that's my birthday. So I fired those letters off, and so now things were beginning to work out. General Greene was replacing Thomas Mifflin as quartermaster general. That was working out. Lafayette could see that there was light at the end of this tunnel. And on March 26th through the 28th, Lafayette evaporated. Nobody knows where he went. So in Lafayette Day by Day, it suggests that he went out for a review of troops, and maybe he did, but we're just not sure. But that left Albany with a command vacuum. Well, Thomas Conway was there. Thomas Conway said, I'm in command, and started issuing orders. Then DeKalb stepped in and said, wait just a minute. You're not in charge. I'm in charge. And countermanded all the orders of Thomas Conway, and then made orders of his own, which were many times contradictory to what Conway had distributed. So this bickering was great theater, it was great entertainment, nothing really came of it. And when Lafayette returned, everything settled down. The day after that, DeKalb, he left and went back to Valley Forge. It was behind him. And on March 31st, Lafayette turned toward Valley Forge and left Albany behind him. This whole episode, there was not a lot of action, there was not a lot of sword play. But Louis Gottschalk said that during this time, Lafayette, teenager that he was efficient, he was industrious, he was intelligent, that he kept his ambition intact, that he was patient, that Lafayette grew during this time, that his character really showed itself during this time. It was difficult, but he was useful, and that time served him. This is Living Lafayette. Discover, to inform, to entertain. Until next time.